The Afro-American Negro loves him some slave movies. That's the only reason that these Hollywood movie studios continue to produce these kind of movies. Because if these kind of movies wouldn't make money, Hollywood movie studios wouldn't continue to produce them. However, when I make the statement the Afro-American Negro loves slave movies, I put an asterisk next to that because that statement, slave movies, only means films that fit within a certain narrative. In order for a film to be considered a slave movie by an Afro American Negro, that film has to feature African slaves who are transported from Africa to America by white Europeans. That constitutes a slave movie to this Afro American Negro. And inside of that film, there must be several story points that fit with the narrative of the Afro American Negro. There must be some scenes of the Afro American Negro laboring in some cotton field. There must be scenes constituting an Afro American Negro being whipped by a white man. There must be some scenes of an African American Negro female being raped by a white man. There must be some scenes of an Afro American Negro in a field or in some sort of shack wearing raggedy clothes. And there must be some scenes of an Afro American Negro being called the N word. All of these constitute what fits the narrative of a slave movie for the Afro American Negro. If you put these elements in the film, the Afro American Negro, like a dog, will start salivating and getting excited because this is the type of film he enjoys watching. Why does he enjoy watching it? Because it presents him in a narrative that fits his slave masters and it allows him to fit within the victim position of the codependent relationship that the Afro American Negro has with his white liberal slave masters. As long as he remains in that victim position and can present himself in that victim position, he will go out and watch that entertainment every time, just like a Pavlovian dog. When they hear the bell being rung, the dog starts to salivate and thinking that there's food coming along the way. And the Afro American Negro loves the slave movie because it allows him to go into victim mode. It allows him to go and get angry at white people. And a lot of them use that victimization to go towards begging towards crumbs from the master's table after they've spent their money with these white businesses and Hollywood movie studios to go watch this wonderful slave movie. Now, if you make a story like I did, a story I did back in 2011 called Amari's Revenge, the Afro American Negro isn't going to like that. Now, for the first 30 or 40 pages of the story Amari's Revenge, I depict slavery, but it's not the slavery that the Afro American Negro is used to. No, this slavery is happening in the nation of Nubia. And what a lot of people don't know is that the Nubian kings and Nubian queens had themselves some black slaves. But the Afro American Negro, he don't want to talk about how the Nubians had slaves. He doesn't want to talk about how the Egyptians had black slaves. He doesn't want to talk about that because it does not fit his narrative and it does not allow him to make himself into a victim. So he won't want to talk about a story like Amari's Revenge because that does not constitute his depiction and his definition of a slave. Now, in the story Amari's Revenge, we see a slave, the character Isis, being beaten like by a black person. So we have the slave who's being beaten by the black person. But the Afro American Negro, no, he won't touch that story. I mean, that's one of the slowest selling books in the SJS Direct catalog, but the Afro American Negro don't want to touch that because it features an African enslaving another African. And he doesn't want to talk about that because, again, it does not fit his narrative. When you look at the narrative that the Afro American Negro wants to talk about regarding slavery, it only talks about slavery in America. He doesn't want to talk about the slavery that transpired in Africa in your Egypt or your Nubia, but the Afro-American Negro will say he is a descendant of pharaohs and kings. He doesn't want to talk about, but he doesn't want to talk about the slavery that went on over there. Nor does he want to talk about the African chieftains on the west side of Africa who sold many of the descendants of the Afro-American Negro into slavery. Nobody wants to talk about that part of slavery because when we look at the Roots reboot and the story of Roots, they only show you evil white folks grabbing up Negroes and putting them on slave ships. No, they don't want to talk about the other part of this, which were the African chieftains. They don't want to talk about that because, again, it does not fit their narrative regarding the ongoing legacy of slavery and white supremacy. When you start talking about the black people who enslaved other black people, the Afro-American Negro starts to become silent. That doesn't fit his context for the entertainment he calls a slave movie. And what constitutes a slave movie pretty much fits the white liberal's narrative because the white liberal loves presenting the Afro-American Negro as a victim because when the Negro is in the victim position, he gets emotional, he's taking things personal, and he'll sit there and say, we really need to watch this movie because it's going to teach us our history. It's going to teach us about our past. Well, you're only being taught a small portion of your past, the part of the past that the white liberal wants to see depicted in film, because he pretty much controls most of the media, and he wants to see a certain narrative being presented of this Afro-American Negro on film. So the only reason why we see so many of these slave films is because of two reasons. Your white liberal, he wants this because it fits his narrative, and because this Afro-American Negro loves these type of films. And he loves these type of films because, again, they fit the narrative that make him presented as a victim. As long as he's in the victim position, he will go see him a slave movie. He is comfortable with the idea of this being a slave movie. But when you start talking about stories like I Write, like Your Amari's Revenge, where I show you a depiction of slavery in Nubia, but the Afro-American Negro doesn't want to talk about that, nor does he want to see a film featuring that. Why? Because the Afro-American Negro cannot make himself out to be a victim in the case of a story where we see a Egyptian pharaoh enslaving blacks, like Ethiopians, a Nubian king enslaving blacks, like other Nubians and Egyptians and Ethiopians, and he doesn't like to talk about those West African chieftains who sold his descendants into slavery. No. Again, he only believes that slavery was like that depicted in Alex Haley's Roots, where there were a group of evil white men who were out here grabbing up Negroes like Kunta Kinte, dragging them off and putting them into slave ships, and then bringing them against their will. He doesn't want to talk about these African chieftains who pretty much set up the slave trade in Africa and made deals with these white men to enslave his descendants. He doesn't want to talk about that. He doesn't want to see that slave movie because that slave movie did not fit within the Negro's narrative. Within that slave movie, the Afro-American Negro cannot present himself as a victim of white supremacy. He cannot talk about, he doesn't want to talk about that ongoing legacy of slavery because, again, he cannot say that some evil white man was the one behind the whole thing. Then he has to stare in the face of another black man. And the Afro-American Negro does not want to take that long, hard look in the mirror and take a look at himself and see that his condition is primarily his own, partially his own fault. The Afro-American Negro never wants to take any sort of responsibility, and that's why he loves himself some slave movies, because the slave movie allows him the ability to point his finger at someone else and make them the one accountable for his modern day dysfunction. However, when we look at the Afro-American Negro community over the last 40 years, we can't say that, really, that it has anything to truly do with the ongoing legacy of slavery. I mean, slavery ended in 1865. And it's been over 100 some odd years, but the Afro American Negro, instead of progressing, is actually regressing. And when you look at the roots of that, they all point to the Afro American Negro. They don't point to many outside forces. Yes, the white liberals' policies are part of it, but the Afro American Negro don't want to talk about the white liberal because he thinks the white liberal is his friend when the white liberal is primarily one of his biggest abusers. But when we look at this Negro as it relates to these slave movies, he is in love with him some slave movies. The Negro love him some slave movies. Those are some of his most favorite movies to see because he loves watching those scenes of these Afro American Negro slaves being whipped by these white people. He loves watching these scenes of these Negroes trying to make these plans to get off this plantation to get to his freedoms. He loves to watch these films where he can sit there and watch the Negroes picking cotton because he loves to see these films because it gives him something that allows him to be a victim. He can look at that and say, "Oh, that's why I am the way I am." When this is not the case at all. When we separate the time period that the white liberal doesn't want to talk about, your Reconstruction, um, and your 19 and your Harlem Renaissance, he doesn't want to talk about those time periods because I can go back to those time periods and really show you some pictures of African Americans who managed to thrive and be successful. I mean, when I was writing my recent two novels, Spinsterella and Spellbound, right now, I'm doing research on the area called Sugar Hill. Now, Sugar Hill is a neighborhood that was up in Harlem back during the 1920s, and this was an entire area full of townhouses owned by black people, a neighborhood owned by wealthy black people, successful black people, um, and built up by black people. But the Afro American Negro, he don't want to tell that type of story. No, he loves him some slave movies because, again, the only two types of eras that the Afro American Negro enjoys making films in primarily and enjoys watching films of featuring um, time periods are your slave era and your civil rights era because both of those eras pretty much depict this Afro American Negro as a victim. Any other time period he doesn't want to talk about. Again, he doesn't want to talk about those Egyptian pharaohs who had Negro had slaves. He doesn't want to talk about those Nubian kings who had black slaves. He doesn't want to talk about these Egyptian chieftains who had black slaves. That legacy of slavery doesn't fit his narrative. Nor does he want to talk about these other time periods in black history, like the one I mentioned about Sugar Hill, and how those working class blacks built that neighborhood into a thriving community. Nor does he want to talk about your Black Wall Street. Nor does he want to talk about your Rosewood. He doesn't want to talk about those periods of history again because those periods of history show us that the Afro American Negro is not a victim of your ongoing legacy of slavery. Those time periods show us that in spite of the racism and white supremacy that was out there, your African Americans went out here and built thriving communities that featured black-owned businesses and had strong two-parent black families. That's what he doesn't want to talk about because those time periods are the ones that pretty much shatter the white liberals' victimization narrative, refute all the ideas of this white liberals' victimization narrative, and pretty much present us a balanced and humanized image of African Americans. And the Negro does not want to see that because the Negro, when he sees those type of images, he cannot go in and start making his excuses and saying that he is a victim and he can't get those crumbs from the master's table. No, he has to go out when he sees those type of images, and if non-black and white people start seeing those images, they're going to start asking this African American Negro to start taking responsibility for his life and to start taking efforts to go and do for himself like those previous generations of African Americans did, in spite of the racism and other issues that they had in America. Because and during those time periods, those black people went out here and again, they built thriving communities. It wasn't the greatest community, but it was their community. They raised families. They had resources, and they did the best that they could. But nobody wants to talk about that in the Afro-American Negro community because too many Negroes love them some slave movies because in many ways, many of these Afro-American Negroes still want to be slaves on the white liberal DNC plantation. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.